I think that it's impossible not to be an optimist if you're an historian, at least in the long run. There will always be diversions, distractions, periods with backlashes and severe problems, but the long-term trends, that arc of history bends towards progress. Especially in these last 200 years, extraordinary 200 years, because until then, nothing much had happened when it came to people's living standards. But then suddenly everything happened at once, for three reasons. Because of a perfect storm of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the revolution of openness in politics and economics, which gave people the freedom to explore strange new ideas and new knowledge. It gave them the freedom to experiment with new technologies and with new business models. And, perhaps most importantly, the freedom to exchange the results and the technology and the ideas with others, across borders and with other nations. And number one is food. Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate, he talked of a nutritional trap in the 18th and early 19th century in France and England. Because of a lack of calories, people could not work hard enough to produce enough food to be able to work hard. But then suddenly, in these last 100 years, we got more food trade across borders and across regions. We got plant science, so better high-yielding crops. And we got artificial fertilizer, so that we can suddenly boost yields. And then Norman Borlaug, the agronomist from Iowa, he turned this into a global green revolution by going to Mexico, to India, to Pakistan, and boost yields with these modern agricultural technologies. And they also created some problems, environmental problems and other things, but most of all, they saved millions and millions of lives. He goes down into history, Borlaug, as the person who probably saved more lives than anybody else. And since 1950, we've seen a revolution in food consumption. It used to be that every second person in the world lived in chronic undernourishment. Today, it's around every 10th person. We go to number two, sanitation. Like the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who threw this extravagant party held court in Erfurt in 1183. The floor of the great hall began to sink, and many noble guests fell into the cesspit beneath, and many nobles died by drowning in the slurry that night. We didn't have to worry about that last night, and very few people do, because of the improvement in sanitation technology, because of the sewers, but more than that, the chlorination, the filters that makes water safe for us to drink. And I do agree, we've heard that earlier today, we do have problems with safe water in the world, but at least over these last 30 years, we've given another 285,000 people access to safe water every day. Number three, life expectancy. In 1800, there was not a single country on the planet where life expectancy was longer than 40 years. Not even the richest ones. Today, there's not a single country where life expectancy is shorter than 40 years, not even the poorest ones. And in the leading country, the one that holds the longest life expectancy has increased by 3 months every year over the last 150 years. We also improve literacy, number four. 200 years ago, only 12% of the world population could read and write. Today, around 12%. Just around 12% can't read and write. And most of that has happened since the 1950s. And of course, with literacy, you can also improve wealth, number five. In the last 200 years, extreme poverty around the world has declined from 90% to 9%. And most of that has happened in the last 25 years because of globalization, because big Asian economies have been integrated into the global economy, and suddenly they can use the ideas, the technologies that makes them more productive, and they can trade with the rest of the world. And that's why in the last 25 years, 138,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty every day. Number six, freedom. 200 years ago, we had slavery in every country on the planet. Today, we don't have slavery formally in any country on the planet, and at least people are fighting it everywhere. We didn't have any real formal democracy with equal rights to vote and government under the law in any country 200 years ago. Now we have a majority of countries. And we are slightly disappointed today. I am too. because we've seen a resurgence of authoritarianism in many countries. China and Russia didn't become democracies and so on. We raised our expectations in 1990 and thought that everything would become more free and liberal. But even since 1990, the proportion of countries that are democracies have increased from around 46% to 63% today, despite the fact that this was 1990 after the walls began to come down. Number 7, equality, minority rights and rights for other groups. Wealth and literacy and freedom results often in more tolerance. Little over a century, no country gave women the right to vote. Now, even in Saudi Arabia, in local elections, women have some part to play. The only place where they can't do that is the Vatican right now. And at least it shows you that rhetorically, almost every part of the world is now saying that they are on track of improving women's rights. If we look at polls, men's attitude today are more feminist than those of women in the 1970s. That tells you something about the progress we're making. Number 8, violence. And actually, despite what we see in the news and experience every day, the world is becoming a more peaceful place as well. There will always be wars going on, obviously. But today, the number of battle deaths is a quarter of what it was when I grew up in the early 1980s. And of course, that was much lower than in the 1960s. And of course, that was much, much lower than in the 1940s. Number 9, the environment. Yes, we're very concerned about the problems of the oceans, global warming and so on, and we should be. But that's because we solved many of the problems that were more urgent and more of a threat to our immediate life. The biggest environmental problems are still the problems of a lack of electricity and gas so that people have to burn wood, biofuels indoors to cook, which kills millions of people because of respiratory diseases and other things. We have solved those problems in every industrialized country. That creates new industrial pollution, which are problematic, which brings us to number 10, the next generation. They will be the ones who can solve this. Because all of these things combine into giving children today a better start in life than ever before. Just 50 years ago, a quarter of all children around the world were child laborers. Now child labor is disappearing in every country that's becoming rich around the world. A child born today stands a greater chance of reaching her retirement day than children in every previous generation had of experiencing her 5th birthday. I wake up every morning and think that the world is falling apart, because that's what I tune into on my cell phone every day. That's the news I get. And we know that's how the media works. If it bleeds, it leads. And that's probably because of our evolutionary predisposition. We have to be problem solvers, we have to be problem seekers. It was the ancestors who were worried, who probably solved a lot of problems, and then they passed on their genes onto us, but therefore also their stress hormones onto us. So we are a worried bunch of people. But the problem is that we then get this sense that these problems are increasing even though they don't. The homicide rate is declining, but we now have global media and social media, so there will always be a serial killer on the loose somewhere. And then that will top the news cycle in every country, and then we will think that this is the everyday experience of most people. But human tragedy is not new. The cell phone camera is. The risk is that if we think that the world is falling apart, it's dangerous. It's impossible to be a historian without being an optimist, but it's also impossible to be a historian without being a bit of a cynic, because mankind has developed these amazing abilities to cooperate, but unfortunately, we developed them to be able to kill others in a better way. That's our evolutionary heritage. So it's very easy for us to get this sense of a threat and then to combine against the common enemy. It's a kind of a fight or flight instinct that's triggered when we feel a certain threat. When we think that the world is falling apart, a kind of an authoritarian disposition is triggered, social psychologists tell us. Generally, as Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has explained, in case of a threat, we get this sense, it's like we press a button where we think that we have to lock down the borders, kick out those who are different, and punish those who are morally deviant. We want to fight. We arm ourselves. We want to kick out the foreigners and the minorities. We want to flee and hide behind tariff barriers and behind walls. And if we then have populist politicians who are eager to exploit this sense that we're drowning in bad news, the world is on fire, they know exactly that they can get that power if they give us the sense that everything is on fire.